Hi, I'm Chet Swearingen with the Revival Ministry, Beautiful Feet. And our name, Beautiful Feet, comes from Romans chapter 10, verse 15, where it says, "How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news." Well, our ministry was started in 2007 in preparation for us becoming missionaries, and then it was incorporated in 2014. And shortly after that, my wife and I, we returned from Indonesia, where we served as missionaries for a little over 5 years. During which time we were blessed to have been part of a church planting movement there in Indonesia. And this was in one of the darkest areas of the globe. It's a very phenomenal move of the Spirit, and we're just blessed to be able to have a role to play in what God was doing through the Indonesian believers there. The singular reason why we left Indonesia, where we were serving as missionaries, to come back to the United States, was to work alongside churches in the state of Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio in preparation for revival. Just to work alongside the churches, doing whatever we can to serve the churches throughout the region in preparation for the revival that we believe that God is going to send. And so for 4 years, we have labored since we've been back from Indonesia, uniting communities in prayer for revival, as well as investing heavily in the education about revival, what it entails, developing a revival seminar, and writing many stories. So by the spring of 2020, we had studied and written over 53 historic revivals. You know, we accumulated all the information about 53 unique revivals that have happened in different places around the globe, and we made them free on our website for people to read. And so now what we see is that there's tens of thousands from around the globe are accessing these stories that we have written, drawing inspiration from them, and building faith for revival in their own communities and in their nation, wherever they may be found. So God has been using us, and we're totally delighted to see how this has all developed. The link that you can, where you can access these revival stories, is at the bottom of each one of our YouTube videos that we're making for the principles of revivals. And so it is from these 53 stories that we have written that we found these principles. So we didn't get these principles out of other people's books. We have extracted them by noting and studying all these revivals that have taken place over the years. So some people assume now, when we're talking about revival, is that some people assume that God never does the same thing twice, and that we cannot duplicate things of the past and expect similar results today. Well, I think what they're saying is that you can't duplicate methods of the past, not that you can't duplicate principles of the past, because principles are like a law. And so this is like a law for revivals, the principles of revival. So when people say you can't repeat things of the past and get similar results today as it pertains to revival, what they're really saying is you can't duplicate methods of the past, not principles of the past. And here's a non-biblical proverb to illustrate my point. Methods are many, principles are few. Methods may change, but principles never do. So these principles are like eternal. They're always in place. And so what we want to do through several videos that we're going to develop is look at 9 different principles that we have found consistently in revivals over the years. And the first principle that we recognize is that all it takes is one spark. And that's where we get the name for our 6-hour revival seminar. It's only one spark revival seminar, because we have found that revivals always begin with an individual. This one individual is always the one that is the one that creates the spark for the revival to begin. So this person, they may play a minimal role in the revival itself, but you will always find this singular person, this individual, who will generate the spark to create the initial fire. There is always that person in every single revival. And the thing is that this individual has been groomed by the Holy Spirit for that unique purpose. And it is often preceded by years of trials and failures and being disciplined by the Lord to make them a holy vessel that He can use to have the honor, the privilege, and the severe responsibility of creating that spark in the first place. So this singular individual does not appoint themselves for this task. It is initiated by God. God puts His hand upon that person, man or a woman. And so that God alone gets the glory for whatever transpires. So this initiator is the first principle that we learn about. Revival always begins in an individual's heart before it spreads to the masses. That is a principle to keep in mind when preparing for revival. Here's a few examples of individuals that have sparked revivals over the years, just a few of them that we'll mention. John Gerardo in the 1857 Anson Street revival in Charleston, South Carolina. He was a pastor there at the Anson Street Presbyterian Church, and he was just so desperate for revival, he just canceled all the preaching. They had their church services where everybody came to the church service, but he wouldn't preach. They just spent all the time praying because he knew that prayer was a major key for revival. So he was an initiator, the one that set the spark for the revival. There was also another man, his name was Jeremiah Lanphier in 1857, the Layman's Prayer Revival. Some people know of it as the Businessman's Prayer Revival or the Fulton Street Prayer Revival. There's actually 10 different names for this particular revival. But anyways, Jeremiah Lanphier, he is the one that initiated prayer specifically for revival. And it caught fire and it spread all over the United States and into other countries. Also another man, young man, James McQuilkin in 1859 in the Ulster, Ireland revival. He's the one initiated. It was a prayer movement. It's about the same thing. We're going to be talking about that. Is one of the principles of revival is extraordinary prayer. And so these men initiated prayer to see the revival start. Another individual was Peggy Smith. She was blind. She was 84 years old. Yet she was the spark behind the 1949 Hebrides revival in the island of Lewis in the north part off the north coast of Scotland. So God can use anybody. There's also Jeanine Branbun in the 1970 Asbury revival. She also gathered students together. She was a college student along with the other ones, and they gathered the students together every morning to pray prior to classes starting. And she's the one that set the spark. So revival principle number one, all it takes is one spark. So what about you? Do you believe, or are you willing to be used by God to be the one that creates the spark? Remember, the one that creates the spark has to go through some significant challenges, trials, purifications, and God will put you through those trials to prepare you so that you can be qualified and prepared to be able to create that spark in the first place. So begin asking God now what you can do in this initial stage to seeing a revival happen in your family, in your church, or in your community. Well, maybe you aren't the one that the Lord will use to create the initial spark, but maybe the Lord would have you pray for that initiator to be wholly surrendered and fully prepared to do and to say and to function however the Lord would call him to act. So just begin to pray and say, Lord, I'm available to be the one that creates that spark, but if you want to use somebody else, just use them, Lord. So that has to be our prayer. Lord, raise up that one that's going to start the spark. Give them courage, boldness. Help them to be totally and completely surrendered to you. That has to be our prayer because that's revival principle number one. There's always a spark that begins it all, and it is always a person. So this is the end of this revival principle number one, and we still have 8 more principles to look at. So make sure you watch these others and make sure you implement these principles. Without implementing these principles that we have presented to you, all this learning and studying and hoping and expecting won't amount to anything if these principles are not implemented.